I have been away from Battle for Azeroth for a long time. It's not been a very engaging expansion, and I haven't even logged in for months, nor have I been making videos as a consequence of that. And I was already on an inactive account when Blizzard made an oopsie and banned Blitzchunk, so there really wasn't that much more that I could do to protest them at that point. Maybe a part of the reason why I haven't been logging in is how much I've changed. More and more of my free time is going towards making my own games, both that platformer fan game and a multiplayer party game for iOS and Android that, well, it'll probably be over a year before I'm really ready to talk about that. And I'm not 100% sure that I'm satisfied with Blizzard's response to Blitzchung, cutting the ban time in half and giving him back his prize money. But I will say that we're making progress against the evil communist oppressors. The United States Congress, more united than it has been in years, has put together a bill to punish China for their actions. It's a promising start, and Trump will sign it. I think that considering how divisive a figure Trump is, it's for the best that he more or less silently go along with the will of the people of America so as not to make America's unity any briefer than necessary. That's pretty much what he's doing right now. So the progress there is promising, but I will say that China's crimes are more far reaching than we know about. Hong Kong is just one aspect of a much bigger problem. Back around 2005, the Communist Party was much more relaxed and was getting more tolerant of things like religion. I picked the date 2005 because around then I was in college and taking a history of Chinese philosophy course. And my professor in that course said that the Communist Party at that point said that a set of moral teachings called Ren, which the West calls Confucianism but is much better translated as humanity, is the way of making a healthy society for China. And the earliest versions of Ren acknowledged a single omnipotent deity as the source of all morality, making it almost like a religion. To be honest, Ren, or at least some forms of it, blur the line between philosophy and religion and doesn't quite fit with the West's strong distinctions. Actually, a lot of things in China don't do well with strong distinctions. Context has a much stronger impact when it comes to Chinese thought and language, but, well, this isn't the video for getting into that. What I can say is the Communist Party's former embracing of Ren meant that they were also becoming more tolerant of religion and, by extension, voices other than their own. Intolerance of voices other than their own was one of the biggest aspects of their human rights violations over the years and still is today. But since 2005, and actually, I don't know when exactly the transition happened, but since then, the Communist Party ended up under new management, and that new management is making the whole party go back to their old ways, making them move backwards in terms of their human rights violations. There's plans for taking Buddhist monks from Tibet and stuffing them into concentration camps. Christian churches have had to go underground. Religious leaders who have traveled outside of China have been blacklisted and aren't being allowed back into the country. We hear about what's happening in Hong Kong, but really Hong Kong is just one symptom of a much bigger sickness that's wreaking havoc across all of China from the Himalayas to the North Korean border. And I know about this thanks to a chance meeting with a Chinese pastor who my family had fallen out of contact with, but who had eaten at our house and we'd eaten at theirs. That pastor and my family happened to be visiting the same church for an orchestra's recital, and we ended up eating out together and discussing all of this over dinner. Now, I really didn't make this video just to talk about China. I had wanted to keep the community informed about what's going on in China since the American media never tells us anything. So with all of that news out of the way, what actually triggered me making this video was the class design changes announced at Blizzcon. On the whole, I guess they're a step in the right direction. But honestly, Blizzard can and should do better. To be honest, the thought patterns that these changes are betraying actually make me feel a little bit concerned. And they make me feel like Blizzard has missed the point again, much like they did in Legion and Battle for Azeroth, actually. And like they missed in the point in Vanilla, for that matter. You'll see what I mean by that as we go on in this video. First, I'd like to say how I would feel if the changes that were announced at Blizzcon for the Paladin class went in as is, exactly as they'd announced, unmodified from their original version. The announcements don't really talk about things like adding another group heal, which is something that I would care about as a Holy Paladin, but I guess it's too soon for those kinds of announcements anyway. It is good that they're making Consecration baseline, because two of the big beefs that I have had with their class design changes for Paladins in general is the lack of AoE damage and the lack of a damage button with no cooldown. Those created suckiness for Holy Paladins during Mists of Pandaria and Warlords, and during Legion and Battle for Azeroth, respectively, and Consecration solves the first problem. Hammer of Wrath, in its given form, mostly but not entirely solves the latter problem. 90% of the time when I'd be reaching for this version of the Hammer of Wrath button, I'd have exhausted all my other damage options, and the enemy will probably be below 50% at that point. With no cooldown on Hammer of Wrath, it provides good filler. However, there are probably going to be some fairly rare cases where enemies will be above 50% and I won't have any damage buttons available. Re-adding the Denounce spell, or better still for class flavor, re-adding a Cataclysm-style Exorcism spell would do a much better job of filling this gap in. Also, while I can tolerate the cast time on Hammer of Wrath as a Holy Paladin, Retribution and Protection are not going to like it. Hammer of Wrath's first form did indeed have a cast time, but that cast time was removed for a reason. Don't get me wrong, when I was in Vanilla and first got Hammer of Wrath back before patch 1.9, I loved how it looked. I loved the sight of that hammer crackling with energy as I was holding it in my hand while casting Hammer of Wrath. That's a positive aspect of the cast timer, but to be honest, the negative aspects outweigh the positive for Retribution and Protection. So if Hammer of Wrath is going to have a cast timer, it should only have a cast timer for Holy. To be honest, I'd still prefer getting Denounce or Exorcism back. The spellbook casting animation that we have nowadays would work a little too well with a Holy Bolt spell animation not to use it. If it was up to me, I would add both. I'd add a Hammer of Wrath spell that would be usable only on enemies below 20% or 35%, and it would be instant cast for Protection and Retribution and timed cast for Holy. This would mean adding more buttons, but Blizzard really needs to get over their phobia of adding more buttons. And now let's move on to auras, and most importantly, why I think the addition of auras is a cause for concern that Blizzard is missing the point of class design. My take on it is that the guiding principle on which Blizzard should be basing everything about class design is the fun factor. Granted, if a class isn't distinct, they might not be fun as they would be if they were distinct. And granted, if a class isn't iconic, then they might not be as fun as they would be if they were iconic. And granted, if a class doesn't have strong identity, they probably won't be as fun as they would be if they did have strong identity. But that does not mean that class identity is the same thing as fun, nor does it mean that distinctiveness is the same as fun. So what is fun? Having a variety of abilities that can be used in different situations, making you feel like you're ready for nigh anything is fun. Having the player doing things, actively pressing buttons, and making meaningful choices, both on the battlefield and during preparation, is fun. Having abilities that look cool and that you can feel the impact of is fun. Those are the things that Blizzard needs to think of first and prioritize first, ahead of class identity, distinctiveness, and how iconic they look. I mean, it seemed like Blizzard was aiming for making the classes look as iconic as possible during Legion. That's why Holy Paladins lost Denounce and instead got a big two-handed hammer with a useless belt buckle of a Libram. Warcraft 3 Paladins wielded two-handed hammers, so some Paladin spec had to do that in Legion. But it couldn't be Retribution because Retribution had to wield Ashbringer, and it couldn't be Protection because Protection needs to be sword and board. So that leaves Holy by default. And Holy can't be seen throwing balls of magic around because that's not what Warcraft 3 Paladins did. So say goodbye to your gap filler spell that gives you flexibility about where you stand while you're doing damage. Oh, and by the way, we're also giving you a mastery that gives you less flexibility about where you stand while you heal. Have fun with that, players! And thus, Blizzard sacrificed the fun factor on the altar of iconicness. What worries me is that this time around, Blizzard will sacrifice the fun factor on the altar of class identity. Honestly, Blizzard should first think about the fun factor, and then circle around and ask, how can we make the class iconic or distinct or have a strong class identity within the confines of making or keeping the class fun? Now that I've explained what I'm worried about, let me explain why I'm worried based on the fact that Blizzard is adding auras. There have been aspects of the Paladin class's identity that have been trimmed over the years other than auras that provided more for the fun factor than auras did. In fact, of all the trimmed bits of the Paladin's design from the whole history of World of Warcraft, auras provide the least amount of fun. Remember, fun is impact, fun is meaningful decisions, fun is the player doing things. Auras don't have an impact that you can feel. They can probably reduce the numbers quite a bit on some fights, but you don't feel that impact during the fight. And there's generally one right choice for the fight when it comes to which aura to have active. So meaningful decisions just aren't there with auras either. And since auras are fire and forget, the player isn't doing anything. So there's about 4 different things I can think of that were trimmed from the Paladin class that they could bring back to make the class feel like it has a strong identity, and I'll explain those 4 things in descending order of how excited they'd make me feel. These 4 things are Holy Power, the Seal and Judgment System, Greater Blessings, and Auras. Now, Holy Power wasn't in and of itself something that added buttons for me to push and impact in decisions. But Holy Power's presence forced the developers to add buttons and to make it so that some abilities generated Holy Power and some spent it. Using those abilities was impactful, and it had me making decisions about when to use those abilities and on who. So Holy Power ended up adding a lot of fun for the Paladin class when it was introduced back in Cataclysm, and it's one of the major contributing factors to why Cataclysm was actually my favorite expansion. That, and the fact that they removed the cooldown on Exorcism, thus giving me a ranged damage ability with no cooldown, which I have sorely missed since Warlords of Draenor. Anyhow, because Holy Power enabled and forced this much fun into the class, if I had to pick one class identity aspect to bring back, it would be Holy Power, hands down. There are ways to avoid the class design pitfalls that happened along the way during Mists of Pandaria and Warlords as well. I've gone over those pitfalls as well as how to avoid them in another video whose link is in the description. The Seal and Judgment system is next. I was not a fan of it early on because back during Vanilla, Blizzard made the dumb mistake of giving Paladins seals and judgments in place of a system of strike abilities. Strikes are impactful, they're buttons to push, and they're choices. Seals were, and in classic WoW still are, like strikes that randomly happen when you auto-attack, taking player agency out of the picture. If I had to guess, Blizzard was trying to make Paladins distinct from warriors with seal spells. But because seals are not impactful, don't have us pushing buttons as often as strikes, and only have us making choices about once every 30 seconds in vanilla, they just plain weren't fun. In essence, Blizzard sacrificed the fun factor on the altar of class distinction. All that being said, if seals exist alongside a system of strikes instead of replacing those strikes, then seals actually are a pretty good supplement. In fact, done correctly, they could in theory be even better than bringing Holy Power back. But bringing Holy Power and Seals and Judgments back might be even better. Seals could affect how we build up resources, they could heal us or other players. They could be a fire and remember decision instead of a fire and forget decision. If, for example, they make us radiate healing to allies when we hit enemies with melee attacks, or if they heal the beacon when we auto-attack or cast exorcism or denounce or what have you, or if they deal AoE damage or impactful things like that. And the judgment debuffs involved could have even more spectacular impact. That's why seals and judgments would be my second choice for what to bring back, or maybe even my first if their effects are nice and impactful. My very distant third choice is greater blessings. Again, greater blessings are pretty fire and forget, but at least they provide a player a choice in preparation of a battle. Or they used to back when we had Blessing of Light, Blessing of Wisdom, Blessing of Salvation, Blessing of Kings, and Blessing of Might. Any one of those could be useful for, say, a hunter. And which one of those blessings is best was a real choice. Heck, Blessing of Sanctuary could be useful in some situations, back before 1.9 when it was an easily reachable talent. Of course, since vanilla, Blessing of Light's effect was merged into our heals, hunters stopped using mana, Salvation's effect was merged with, well, everyone except for tanks. Wisdom and Might's effects were merged with each other into a single blessing. Each of those design decisions was a step in the right direction, and I wouldn't want to sacrifice any of them just so that there's a real decision about which blessing I cast on my allies. So you can see why one reason why re-adding greater blessings is so low on my list. But even bigger reasons for that are the fact that greater blessings are fire and forget, the impact just isn't there, and neither are they making you react to a fight and push buttons. There's just not that much fun with greater blessings. And even worse than greater blessings are auras, but for many of the same reasons. They're fire and forget, you have even less agency because you don't need to recast them on allies before a fight, there's no visible impact, and not much choice either. I mean, in theory, you could react when enemies are casting and switch from Devotion Aura to a Resistance Aura in response to a boss casting spells, but since spell resistance isn't much of a thing anymore, we might not even have that. This lack of agency makes both blessings and auras unexciting, no matter how much they affect the numbers. But because auras have even less player action than greater blessings do, blessings are the lesser of two evils. It's kind of strange to use the word evil for a buff to the class, but honestly, considering that Holy Power or reimagined Seals and Judgments would be so much better for the fun factor, I'd say it's practically a sin of omission to forego those in favor of auras or blessings. Again, it would be sacrificing the fun factor on the altar of class identity to pick auras or blessings over Holy Power or reimagined Seals. And I'm not really calling for class identity to be sacrificed on the altar of the fun factor here either. Honestly, you can have both, and should. It's a question of priority. Blizzard really needs to think about the fun factor first, and then think about how they can make class identity work within the confines of the fun factor. There's ways you can make class identity work and make class identity strong within the confines of the fun factor. And that is how you make a good game. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If a game is not fun, then what is that game? Bad game reviewers on YouTube will tell you the answer to that. Now, I could end on that note, but I think there's an even better note for me to end on. A call to action for Blizzard and a suggestion for how to make the game as awesome as possible. In a previous video, the same one that I've got as a link in the description, I suggested that the Blizzard developers should put together game trailers for each spec to show off what changes are going to happen, and they should make every decision about what they do to each spec with that trailer in mind. How can they make players of that spec excited by watching that trailer? What can they add to each spec to make players not just happy with what they're getting, but excited? I'd like to suggest that Blizzard actually take this idea, albeit for classes instead of for specs. This will force the developers to take the fun factor into account. It'll force the developers to take off their developer hats and put on their player hats, and to think about what will look good and look exciting to the players. That will keep them thinking about what decisions they can make to give players impact, agency, and meaningful decisions during gameplay. It'll force the developers to move classes forward instead of moving them backward like they've done all too often in the previous expansions, because the developers will constantly need to keep in mind the fun factor and how to make things look awesome to players every step of the way. I honestly believe that the trailer concept will help move the game forward and do more to ensure that Blizzard comes out with a quality product. So it's my sincere hope that someone at Blizzard sees this video and decides to make their own videos in response. 12 of them. One for each class, full of players who deserve a fun experience full of impact, agency, and meaningful decisions. So Blizzard, make a meaningful decision of your own. Make your developers make those trailers.